bobbies on the beat have been slashed by almost a third. Isn't it a government's top priority to keep you and me safe? Yeah, a very good evening indeed. We're also live on our Facebook Live page. A little later on, you may have heard the news, the sad news coming from America this evening. The police in Florida say a number of people, it's believed I think to be 4, have been killed following a mass shooting at a video game tournament in Jacksonville. Many others are thought to have been taken to hospital. We will bring you right up to date with the very latest on that story over the course of this hour. Some harrowing reports, as you might expect, emerging over the past hour or so, including a player taking part, just 19 years old, Drini Gujoka, who described the shooting in a series of posts on Twitter, calling it the worst day of his life. He said, "I am literally so lucky the bullet hit my thumb." Well, what I want to get stuck into right now with you is this rather astonishing Sunday Times investigation that has found that bobbies on the beat have been slashed, as I say, by just short of a third in the space of 3 years. Now, this is at a time, of course, when violent crime in England and Wales has almost doubled in that same period. And that is a remarkable figure, isn't it? Violent deaths, as we know, in London alone have already hit 100 this year. How on earth can we drive those numbers back down with so few officers on our streets? I want to know whether you feel safe on your roads, wherever you are across the United Kingdom. I think we need more officers on the beat. And if you're a regular listener to me on LBC on Saturday and Sunday mornings, you'll know that I'm not always the first to stick up for Jeremy Corbyn, but it has been Labour Party policy. It was their policy and election pledge going into last year's general election to put 10,000 officers back onto our streets. Is this government keeping you and keeping me safe? And are we heading towards some sort of dual policing in this country where there could be a private police force for the wealthy? Well, I want to speak first to Peter Kirkham, who's a former detective chief inspector with the Metropolitan Police, to get Peter's views on this story. Peter, a very good evening to you. What is your perspective here?
Well, I think anybody that listens to LBC regularly will know perfectly well what my perspective is, because I've been banging on about it, as have a number of other policing commentators, for the best part of 8 years. If you cut the number of police officers, all you get is less policing. Fewer officers mean fewer hours to do policing tasks, and therefore less policing is delivered to the public. It is purely and simply as simple as that. The government would have you believe that in 2010 there were lots of cops sitting around doing nothing. There weren't. There were some parts of the organisation where demand had fallen and where there was maybe some spare capacity, but there were also a number of areas like cybercrime, like child sexual exploitation, the list goes on, where the police response had been lacking and where they needed additional officers. So what might have been needed was a rearrangement of those officers, but certainly not a reduction of them. And the idiot Prime Minister, who was Home Secretary at the time, had this view that because crime is going down, then the number of police officers can go down as well. That just betrays her total, and her advisors, her total lack of understanding of how policing operates. And if you do the maths, you find that we are now spiralling into the abyss. I've started using the Policing in Crisis hashtag on Twitter for the last about 8 months. Before that it was crisis in policing. It's now policing in collapse. In parts, certainly in the Met, certainly elsewhere in the country, in parts it is in slow motion collapse for a whole variety of reasons that we could discuss. But the bottom line is that if you take police officers out of public space, which is what this government has done by means of its cuts, because you can't have the police not responding to calls, you can't have the police not investigating the more serious crimes, you can't have them not investigating the murders. So if you take them out of public space because they've got all these other things to do, you hand that public space over to the criminals and the thugs. And it is no surprise at all that what happens is the criminals and thugs run riot.
Peter, what would you say, though, to the Home Office, who've said, in response, I think, to this investigation, decisions about frontline policing and how resources are best deployed are for chief constables and democratically accountable police and crime commissioners? Is that shifting responsibility, do you think?
It's book-passing nonsense. They know perfectly well that the police can only deploy the resources they've got the money to deploy, and 70 to 80% of police service funds come from Home Office grants. PCCs and the Mayor in London have done what they can to raise the precept on council tax to the maximum, and that's been extended a little bit, but they're still a drop in the ocean compared to the huge cuts from the Home Office. So those mandarins at the Home Office are lying through their teeth.
This is powerful language that you're using. Idiot Prime Minister and mandarins at the Home Office, you accuse them of lying through their teeth. It's not just mandarins or the Prime Minister who you might be attacking. Simon Cole is the Chief Constable of Leicestershire Police and National Lead for Local Policing. He's said that cybercrime, county lines, that's drug dealing controlled from cities, of course, and the changing face of terrorism has meant that frontline officers also needed support from IT and training experts. He said, quoted in the Sunday Times, reductions in budgets means we have to do things differently.
Yeah, we have to do things differently because they have to make the best of what they've got. But Simon Cole is one of the chief constables, of which there are 43, and there are dozens of other deputy chief constables and assistant chief constables, and frankly they have failed almost exclusively. There's a few honourable exceptions, but they have failed almost exclusively to do their duty. Their job is to speak truth unto power, and they have signally failed to do that. So Prime Minister, Home Office, National Police Chiefs Council members, almost without exception, they are responsible for this, and they are going to have to be held accountable at some point, because there is now, I don't think, any quick way of getting back from where we are. You cannot put the cat back in the bag, and the cat is well and truly out of the bag.
Just very briefly, Peter, it's not as though Theresa May has not been warned. We found out last year in the aftermath of the horrific Manchester terrorist attack that she was warned 2 years previously, back in 2015, that cuts to policing were putting Manchester and national security at risk by a gentleman that she awarded a prize for being the Community Police Officer of the Year.
Yes, it was an inspector from Greater Manchester Police who had seen his neighbourhood policing teams cut. Even back then, this is going back several years, even back then he'd seen the cuts to the point where he couldn't deliver proper community policing, and so he left community policing, even though he was the top sort of community police officer of that year. And he stood up in the Police Federation conference and warned her to her face that the things that would be happening because there was no community policing would cause serious crime and terrorism. And lo and behold, from his actual area, the Manchester bomber arose. Now, if there'd been solid community policing there, that may or may not still have happened, but there would have been a damn sight more chance than with no community police there. She arrogantly dismissed all warnings as crying wolf and scaremongering. We weren't crying wolf. We know what we're talking about. She doesn't, and she is totally personally responsible for this, and I fear nothing will change until she goes, because if anybody else in government, like Sajid Javid, the new Home Secretary that's got fine words, if they actually try and reverse any of her policies, it will undermine her, and that they can't be seen to do that.
All right, Peter Kirkham, thank you very much. As I say,